r/nosleep. Posted by you/Goodwin 1990. We found an emergency distress buoy floating in the Pacific. The message it contained made me never want to step foot in the ocean again. Part 2, Final. Friends. Part 1. Video link in description. Please check out. Okay, so before I transcribe these final few pages, I need to say that this will be my very last post about the buoy, and the pages themselves. I didn't expect anyone to realize what I was up to so quickly, but I was woken up this morning by a knock at my door. When I answered it, I was met by one of the men who had been at the dock the day the buoy was taken by the Navy. He stated he'd only come to ask a few follow-up questions, such as, what our location was when we caught it in our nets, what the tides were like and so on. I knew it was a bunch of bullshit, as it was information he could have gotten from my captain. He knew I knew it as well. That's when he not so subtly began threatening me, speaking about prison time, and worse, for leaking, as he put it, confidential documents, before leaving. I'm currently packing my suitcase and leaving a message for my real estate agent, to ask her to list my house for sale, along with one to my captain, telling him I won't be showing up anymore. I'm not sticking around, and as soon as I post this, I'm going to just get into my truck and drive. I'm going to disappear, and I'm going to stop somewhere in the middle of nowhere and burn the copies of the pages I have. Besides, I don't think I can wake up and look out at the ocean anymore. Here are the final pages. When we got back to base, we found even more chaos than we'd left. As we exited the airlock, Figueroa and King supporting Brockman, who was now hysterically crying, I heard confused and angry shouting coming from the operations room. Instructing Brockman be brought to the medical bay to have her checked out, I removed myself from my team and headed towards the half-open hatch to see what the commotion was about. When I pushed open the door, I saw David standing inches from Carruthers' face, his face a mask of panic and rage. What the hell is going on out there? He almost screamed. I hurried to get in between the two of them, in case my old friend ended up losing his temper enough to physically assault our commander. Pushing them apart, I turned my head to look at both of them. Whoa. What in the name of God is going on? David looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw something I never had before. And it made me feel uneasy. There was a mixture of pure, animalistic fear and defensive anger there. He began to shout again, but I grabbed him by his shoulders. Calm yourself, Dave. Yelling isn't going to help anything right now. Take a deep breath, and tell me what happened. He bent almost in half for a moment, trying to suck in deep breaths of air before standing up and telling me what had happened. 3 of the 6 members of his team were gone. They had been exploring the wreck and had discovered a massive fissure in its hull, almost as if it had steamed headlong into a reef. They were documenting the apparent cause of its sinking, when a strong rush of water had caught him and 3 others in his team, picking them up off the ocean floor and almost flinging them over a dozen yards from where they'd been. The seafloor had also been kicked up, making visibility difficult to see. When they'd been able to make it back to the side of the wreck, the other 3 were just gone. There was no trace of them at all. Almost exactly like what had happened with Carpenter. I turned to Carruthers and asked him if there was anything at all about the 2 sites that he knew, that we didn't. He insisted that he had no knowledge he was withholding from us. I felt too emotionally drained to try and push the issue, so I turned to my colleague and, in as calm of a voice, told him that there was no use in fighting that didn't use up unnecessary energy, and we needed to keep our heads level, if not for our own sake, then the rest of us. He looked at me hard for a long moment, and then nodded, before turning and heading back through the hatch. With the situation diffused, I turned back to Carruthers. Has the storm above us blown out or passed yet? Do we have any contact at all with the surface? He rubbed his hands over his eyes. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in 20 minutes. No, he said wearily. The storm was still directly over our heads, and though he'd tried the emergency long-wave radio, he'd received no response. Until it passed, we were completely cut off. I rubbed my own eyes, and then told him that until we could re-establish communication with the surface teams, it'd be safer if no one else went outside. He agreed, then turned and slumped into his chair, his body sagging with the weight that had now fallen on his shoulders. I left him alone, glancing back at his back. Despite my own grief and fear, I couldn't help but feel sympathy for the man. He would be the one who bore the brunt of the blame for this, since he was the commanding officer on this station. I shook my head and exited, closing the hatch behind me and hurried to check on Brockman. Thankfully, she'd only suffered a minor emotional breakdown, and had been given a light sedative to help her sleep. The rest of the teams were instructed to go and get some rest, and one by one, they filed out of the med bay, their expressions all a clear mix of anxiety and fear. Letting them go, I decided it would be best if I spoke to the head doctor about what I'd seen out there. Pulling her aside, I described in detail the moments leading up to Carpenter's disappearance, along with the thoughts I'd been having. She listened intently, and then commended me for my rational thinking. She did agree that I could have been affected by an early onset of nitrogen narcosis, and took 2 blood samples to check and see if our hypotheses were correct. As I left, she also informed me that the computer in the research lab had beeped once, indicating a partway translation success. I thanked her and then headed to the lab to check before resting myself. Entering the dimly lit room, I crossed to the computer and shook the mouse to bring it out of hibernation mode. The screen came to life and glowed brightly, the one word it had deciphered proclaimed in big black letters. Away. As I turned to leave, a voice from the other side of the lab made me nearly jump out of my skin. Desmond whirling to face whoever had said my name, I found Figueroa sitting at the examination table, one of the carvings lying in front of her. Good God, Liza, give me a heart attack, why don't you? I said, leaning against the wall to study myself. She gave me a small, strained smile. Sorry, I thought you'd seen me. I held up a hand in the universal sign for it's okay. What are you still doing up? You should be trying to get some rest. Like the others, she motioned for me to join her at the table, and I walked over. My mind is still racing too much to try and sleep, at least yet, she said, and then gestured to the carving. Have a look at the depictions on this. With a quick glance at her, I pulled on a pair of sterile gloves and gently pulled it towards me. Is this the carving they're trying to translate? I asked. No, not this one, she replied. That's over there. She pointed to the scanning machine behind the computer, where a large black cylindrical machine whirred softly. She continued. Remember the giant monster and its underlings that we've seen depicted on many of the other carvings we've seen? Well, if you look here, she pointed to a section which showed what appeared to be them in combat with other creatures. It appears they were locked into a sort of underwater siege with the beings here, she finished, and I looked closer. I could see the giant, ill-headed creature looming behind his underlings, pointing with one of his clawed hands like a general commanding his troops. On the other side, were what appeared to be creatures that, as close as you could come to describing them, were mermaids. They were humanoid in shape, with more human-like features than their adversaries, but still contained fish-like features. Large, fish-like eyes and mouths containing sharp teeth were the biggest giveaways. Behind them stood what had to be their leader, who was equal in stature to the eel monster. The biggest difference between him and his soldiers was the fact that a giant pair of tusks protruded from his mouth, and a single eye dominated his upper face. I looked up at Figueroa. So, do you know who won this battle? I asked. She shook her head. No, but if you look here, she pointed to a symbol similar to the inner spiral of a nautilus shell seemingly tattooed on the tusk leader's chest. I've seen this symbol on many of the ruins we've studied. It suggests that the ruins are theirs, or at least the people who worship them. Not theirs, she gestured at the eel creature. I ran my fingers over the carving, taking in it all. Interesting. We'll have to cross-reference it against any other known ancient civilizations of the area to see if there's any bleeding over of their myths. I stood up to leave, but she grabbed my wrist gently. That's not all, she said softly, before rotating the ruin over to reveal the other side. After a second of staring at it, my eyes grew wide. I jerked my head to look up at her. She simply nodded. My voice shook uncharacteristically. How is that possible? Depicted on this side of the ruin, which almost appeared to be in much better, much newer condition, was a carving of what appeared to be the eel-headed monster, pulling down a battleship, while the tusk creature attempted to stop him. A World War II battleship. And, more to the point, it looked almost exactly like the wreck which David's team had found, and had been exploring. Both leaders' underlings swarmed under and around them. The viperfish-headed ones attempted to dismember and devour the drowning sailors, while the mermaid-looking creatures attempted to save them. Liza, how is that even possible? I asked again, almost in a whisper. She shook her head gently. I don't know, she said softly. I held her gaze for a moment, then pulled off my gloves and stepped around the table. I took a deep breath, then spoke over my shoulder. You should try and get some sleep. I will, she said. Soon as I went to exit, I turned and asked her one final question. If that battle depicted is the newest carving in terms of age, then, what does that mean? What happened to, what appear to be, for all intents and purposes, the side of good in these battles? Figueroa looked up from the ruin, answering me simply, but seriously. Maybe they lost. Trying to ignore the growing feeling of insects crawling under my skin, I shook my head and left the lab for my cabin. I wouldn't be able to fully understand the message until the rest had been deciphered and translated, and until then, all I could do was chase shadows and scare myself. The same went for the carvings. As I entered my cabin, a flash of a thought entered my mind. I remembered why that tricycle I'd sworn I'd seen had looked so familiar. It was almost identical to one that I'd played around on in my parents' front yard as a kid. If I didn't know any better. No, knock it off, Desmond. There is no way it could have been the same. Things just don't pop out of your mind into the real world. Lying down on my bunk, I glanced again at the photo on the table. I reached out and caressed the cheek delicately. Jackie, please, wherever you are babe, help me get through this, I whispered, then rolled over and pulled the thin sheet up to my shoulders, forcing my eyes closed, and soon fell into a restless sleep, a sleep perturbed by nightmares of Carpenter and the 3 members of David's team, screaming in the dark void as if they were being skinned, torn apart, and eaten alive. Desmond. I rolled over in my bunk, fighting back the waking world. I grunted. Desmoon, darling. I pulled myself partway out of my slumber. Yeah, Jackie, what is it babe? I mumbled, trying to get comfortable. We really needed a new bed in the house. This one was getting old and uncomfortable, almost like there was metal underneath. I shot up straight as though I'd been zapped with electricity, reality slamming into my brain and reminding me that I wasn't sleeping in my own bed at home in Coos Bay. I was almost a mile underneath the ocean. And Jackie wasn't anywhere near here. Jackie wasn't anywhere anymore, not for 4 years. My breath came in huge, ragged gasps, cold sweat coursing down my body. You couldn't have heard that, it was part of your dream, you didn't actually hear her voice. That's what I kept repeating to myself over and over, willing the mantra to sink in. After a minute or so, I started to believe it, and forced myself to lie back down. I turned back onto my side, and began to close my eyes again, when a loud, piercing scream suddenly rang out from the corridor. My mind reacted faster than my body could relay information, and I flew out of bed, promptly tripping over the sheet that had entangled itself around my legs. Rubbing my head where it had hit the grated floor, I stumbled back to my feet and raced out into the hall. Everyone's hatches were open, and frightened faces all peered around the edges. All except one. I rushed from my cabin towards Brockman's half-closed door and yanked it open. She lay there quivering, backed against the corner of her bed that was nearest the wall, her knees pulled up against her chest and her head tucked in them. I slowly crossed the small room and knelt on the bed in front of her. Brockman? She didn't respond. I tried using her first name. Tish, what happened? A muffled reply came from between her knees which I couldn't hear. What? She raised her head slightly, not enough to reach my eyes, and this time I heard her clear enough to understand, though her voice was muffled, still muffled slightly from the mucus freely flowing from her nose and over her lips, giving it almost a burble. I heard him. A shiver passed down my spine, though I couldn't understand why. Heard him? Who's him? Who did you hear? I asked gently. She raised her head completely, now meeting my gaze. She wore a look of almost petrified terror in place of the usual relaxed and happy expression I had grown to know and care about. Her voice trembled furiously. I heard Sean calling out my name in the dark, asking why we'd left him there. He said. She choked back a sob and finished her sentence, her voice rising into a shrill scream. He said what happened to him was nothing compared to the end we would receive, that we'd all end up dying here in this base, screaming in the dark. I stared in shock and sadness at her. She was completely going over into the deep end. Losing her close friend had absolutely shattered her psyche, and she was beginning to hear things. I made my voice as soothing as I possibly could, reaching out and gently putting a hand on her shoulder. She flinched slightly, but didn't pull away. Tish, it's okay. Nobody else is going to die down here. We're all going to make it back up top as soon as the storm clears. You didn't hear Sean, you're just mentally scarred from losing your friend. It'll be all right. She pulled her head up again to look at me, and I pulled back sharply at what I saw. The look on her face had changed, she no longer looked terrified. It had been replaced by a look of almost complete insanity. A smile crossed slowly over her lips, but this wasn't a happy smile. In fact, it made her look almost demonic in the low light. A small giggle escaped her, and her eyes burned holes into mine. That's not all he said to me. He also said that you have a fate worse than any of ours. It's taken special interest in you, because you're so damn smart and have such inner strength. She giggled again. It's going to take its time with you, Desmond. It's going to leave you for last. And you'll scream longer and worse than we ever will, and with that, she collapsed into unconsciousness. I slowly stood up and moved away from the figure on the bed. I knew that she hadn't been right when she had said those things. That her cracking mind had simply thought them up from a very dark place. And yet, I couldn't help but feel unrelenting chills pass through my body. Her words had wound their way past my rational thinking and into the deepest corners of my own mind. And they were repeating themselves there, making me feel as though I were continuously being doused in ice water. I backed out of the cabin, allowing the medical team to enter and take her to the med bay to keep an eye on. Turning to the rest, I found them all staring at me, some of their faces confused, On others, fear. Figueroa locked eyes with me as I scanned the group. I nodded at her, and tried to keep the shake out of my voice. It's over with, guys. Let's try and get a few more hours sleep. We need it, and with that, I walked back into my cabin, Brockman's words echoing in my brain. You'll scream longer and worse than we ever will. Trying to push it away, I laid back down again and closed my eyes, willing myself to fall back asleep and trying to ignore the voice of my dead wife calling to me from somewhere in my subconscious. Desmond. Nope, not listening. You're not there, you're only in my head. Desmoon. Still not listening. Desmond. I shot up in my bunk, that voice had been one of the team. It came again. Desmond, wake up and get in here. I stumbled to my feet, careful to make sure I didn't trip again on the sheets, and ran barefoot into the corridor. I recognized the voice now. It belonged to King, and it was coming from the operation room. Flying through the open hatch, I turned and saw him staring at the bank of monitors that showed the external views from the cameras mounted on the exterior of the base. Joining him, my breath was wrenched from me like a knife had just pierced my lungs. On the screen from the camera facing out from above the eastern airlock, was an image we couldn't possibly be seeing. Tell me you're seeing that too, Windows, King said in a voice that shook slightly. I could only nod in response. There was a diver out there. Whoever it was standing with their back towards the camera, but we could tell it was one of our dive suits. I asked him to zoom in to the lower part of the thruster assembly. Each individual diver had their name stamped on their respective suits to avoid confusion. We'd be able to tell who it was. As the letters came into focus, both of us let out our breath in a huge gasp. That's Carpenter, King whispered after a moment. I kept on blinking my eyes, willing for the letters to change, but they remained the same. That's fucking impossible, I said. He would have run out of air more than 10 hours ago. There is absolutely no way he could possibly still be alive. He looked over at me, his eyes showing that he was trying to make sense of what was before us, but unable to. Then how in the hell did his body float all the way back here? I couldn't think of anything to respond with. Even I'd wanted to, I couldn't. Carruthers, Figueroa and Nodding must have heard King's shouts, because they entered the room, Figueroa rubbing her eyes. What's going on? She asked sleepily. Yeah, Nodding echoed. What's you? His eyes grew wide as he saw what we were looking at on the screen. Carpenter? He breathed out. Carruthers moved in between me and King quickly. He couldn't have survived this long out there, could he? He asked me quietly. I gave my head an almost imperceptible shake, just enough for him to notice. He stared again at the monitor, then turned back to the other two. Guys, I'm sorry to have to be the one to say this, but... He was cut off by Figueroa, who was pointing towards the screen we were now facing away from. Oh my god, he's alive. She yelped. We all swiveled back toward the screen. But the suit was in the same place as it had been when I'd first seen it. I turned back. Liza. I began gently, but Nodding cut in. No, she's right, I saw the suit's arm lift up as well, he's alive. Carruthers, King and I tried to quiet the two of them. We could hear the rest of the group coming down the corridor, but suddenly Nodding was a blur or motion, running towards the hatch and beyond, the airlock. He's alive, damn it. He screamed. I'm not leaving him to die out there. Carruthers tried running after him. Nodding was trying to pull the hatch closed when he grabbed the handle. Evan, don't be fucking stupid, he yelled. The hatch reversed direction quickly, smashing him in the head and knocking him on his back. Figueroa and I rushed to check on him. Blood was seeping from a newly formed gash just below his hairline. One of the doctors poked their head through the door. What the hell's going on? He asked incredulously. I snapped my head up from the half-conscious man. For God's sake, stop him! I screamed. Everybody turned to look away, and I heard the airlock door close and seal itself from the inside. I leapt up, leaving Carruthers to be held by Figueroa, and ran to the airlock door. Looking through the small porthole, I saw that Nodding had already got into his suit and sealed it. I pounded on the metal hatch. Carpenter's fucking dead, you idiot. But he either didn't hear my yell through the thick door, or simply ignored me. I saw him reach out with one clawed hand and smack the manual activation switch on the wall. The sound of the hatch filling with water filled my ears, and I screamed the same sentence I had already as the water rose over the porthole, begging that it would knock some sense into him. But it didn't. He reached down, turned the hatch with both claws, and then thrust it out of the airlock. I turned and ran back into the now crowded observation room, almost smashing into the monitors as I frantically searched the screens for the one that was linked to his suit-mounted camera. Finally, I found it in the lower right-hand corner. He was on the bottom now, using short thrusts to close the distance between himself and the suit. I searched for the button to establish comms with his suit and stabbed it when I found it. Gripping the microphone tightly, I tried to speak in as calm of a voice as I could muster. "Evan, please, listen to me. Please, come back into the airlock." "No, Desmond, he's alive," he replied defiantly in a small burst of static. "Evan, please, listen to common sense. Carpenter has been out there for over 14 hours, he only had enough air for 8. He can't possibly be alive. Please, I'm begging you, you don't want to see what's in there." But he ignored me. I heard him calling out over the open comm channel. "Hey, Sean, buddy," he called out. The still form less than 8 feet in front of him didn't reply. "Sean, buddy, thank God you made it back," he pressed on. "I'm sorry we left you out there, man, but we couldn't find you. Please, turn around and come back inside with me. We'll help you feel better." Still nothing but silence. But Nodding suddenly continued on as though he'd received an answer. "Why can't you turn around, man?" My brow furrowed in confusion, and I felt the same shiver that had passed through me when Brockman had made her insane declaration return. I glanced away from the screen and was greeted by the same look of uneasiness in the rest of them. I was brought back to the screen when I heard him speak again. "Why didn't I think before that you wouldn't be almost completely frozen by now? Of course I'll help you turn around and pull you back inside." He was now directly behind the suit, and I saw him reach out a claw to hook onto its arm tether. In that moment, I also noticed something else. Something that turned my blood to ice and almost completely tore away the sanity from my mind. A pale, webbed, clawed hand, gently holding onto the side of the suit, just below the waist. As if keeping it in place. I snatched for the microphone to scream for Nodding not to touch the suit. But it was already too late. He had gripped the tether and slowly began to turn it towards him. Just before the front of the suit came into view, his screen cut off into static. A split second later, so did all of the cameras facing the eastern side of the base. For a few moments, there was absolute silence in the room as we stared at the static-filled screens. Then, it was shattered by the sound that almost leapt out of the speakers. Nodding had begun to scream, the same high-pitched, almost girly scream that he had made when he discovered the rubber eel Figueroa had put into his bed, only this time, there was nothing funny about this scream at all. It never wavered at all, he never drew in a breath to continue screaming. It was simply one long, unending scream, one filled with more horror and pain than I'd ever heard anyone filled with before. It was so loud that it almost drowned out anything that was happening in the background. Almost. There was another sound that was barely audible underneath, that almost inhuman wail. And it rooted me to the spot and drained all the blood from my face. It was the sound of something tearing apart his suit. For a split second, it was replaced by the sound of flesh tearing from bone, and then the sound of the ocean rushing into his suit overwhelmed it. Nodding screams became muffled through the water for another moment, and then abruptly cut off, the salt water short-circuiting his calm link and filling the speakers with nothing but static. I stood rigid, the hairs all along my body standing up on end, my mind trying to make sense of the horror I had just witnessed, and I slowly turned back to the rest of the group. Their faces all held the same ashen, terrified expressions I knew my own face held. And then I heard the voice again. Her voice. "Desmond." I closed my eyes and pressed my hands to my temples, attempting to force away the voice of the love of my life who had died 4 years ago in a boating accident. But this time, it didn't go away. "Desmuin." I opened my eyes as I felt the stinging sensation of hot tears forcing their way out of my tear ducts, and saw all of the others also holding their hands to their heads. A few of them fell to their knees and curled up into tight balls. "Mother?" I heard King let out in a pained voice. At the same time, Carruthers, who had pulled himself back into consciousness, was leaning against the hatch, his face contorted into a face I had worn at my wife's funeral, total anguish. "Abigail." He whimpered. "I'm so sorry that Daddy couldn't protect you, please, forgive me." The realization hit me like a freight train in that instant, connecting the soul-piercing pieces together in the one jigsaw puzzle I wish my mind wouldn't have been able to solve. The voice in my head, and the ones the others were hearing. The disappearance of Carpenter and the members of David's team. The storm overhead. The sunken battleship, not torn apart by a reef, but by something. The tricycle, my childhood tricycle, plucked out from my memories and shown to me. The carvings on the pillars of the monstrosities, ruins that I now knew had never seen the surface in their entire existence. The single word that had been translated from the language on the stone we'd brought back. The piece that Nodding had knocked over in the almost endless darkness that had lain beneath it. A prison. It all fit, and it completely shattered my view of reality. Oh dear God, what have we done? At the same time, I heard a sound from out in the corridor, loud enough to be heard over the whispering voice that wouldn't go away. It was one that sent the same ice-water sensation through my body and almost caused me to piss myself. The sound of the outer airlock door closing and something lumbering over towards the drain cycle switch. Whatever spell had been keeping me in place shattered, and I flew past everyone into the corridor towards the inner hatch. Whatever had killed Notting, you know exactly what killed Notting, Desmond, Jackie's voice cooed inside my head. Its tone now shifted from the tone I lovingly remembered into one that was terrifyingly sinister, had made its way into the airlock and was now trying to get inside the base. And we would all be dead if it was able to. I slammed into the hatch, staring through the porthole, and in that instant, all semblance of sanity fled my body from what I saw. My fractured mind was only able to take in two details. The head, that awful head that looked exactly like that of a viperfish, which turned to stare at me with one large, bulbous eye, with the mouth that, even though had no lips, seemed to turn from a threat display into a leering grin of what I could only describe as pure evil and malice. And, clutched in one webbed, clawed hand, oh dear Jesus, was Notting's severed head, his face eternally frozen with the same look of horror and pain that had been bestowed upon the poor souls in the carvings, the last drops of blood dripping from the torn flaps of skin below his neck where it had once connected with his body. I screamed as loud as I could for anyone to come help me keep the hatch closed. For a second, there was no reply at all, and I felt myself deflate inside. They were all still in their own personal hell, haunted by the voices placed in their heads, no, pulled out of their heads, and didn't hear me. The water was almost completely drained from the airlock, and though I didn't glance through the porthole again, I knew it was coming closer to the hatch, ready to yank the wheel out of my grasp and come inside to begin its slaughter. I could hear its wheezing gasps. I screamed one last time, a scream more of defiance than help, when three shapes smashed into the hatch on either side of me. Figueroa, Alton and King had somehow snapped out of the trance and made their way over to me. "We have to seal the hatch." Figueroa screamed. "How?" "There's a manual lock on the door you need to press," Alton yelled. "Where?" I yelled back. "It's right below your left knee," King interjected. I swung my gaze down as I felt the wheel being torn from my grasp as it began to spin and unlock, spying the large black button set low in the door. I let go and let my own weight simply bring myself to my knees as I heard the loud click of the hatch unlocking and slammed the button with my fist as hard as I could, begging to a god I hadn't believed in since childhood that I'd hit it in time. "Manual east airlock seal, activated," a robotic voice said from somewhere behind me. The wheel spun itself back into the locked position, and I could hear the creature let out a loud hissing sound, though whether it was of pain or defeat, I couldn't tell. We all breathed a collective sigh of relief as reinforced bolts slammed into position. Feeling victorious, I stood up, not staring into the porthole again, but aiming my voice into it. "Fuck you, you stupid scaly son of a bitch," I yelled at it. "Manual override trumps any strength your ancient ass may have. You lose, you seafood menu reject." For a second, the other three all stared at me, and then they slowly began chuckling. A second later, I joined in and we all slid down the door into sitting positions against it, laughing softly to each other. A soft voice choked away our laughter and echoed through the corridor. "You think you've won, Desmond?" We all looked up to see Brockman standing in the center of the junction, somehow awake and wearing only a patient gown. In her left hand was one of the doctor's scalpels. Blood dripped from the blade and the clenched fist that held it. I could only assume it belonged to the medical team. I pressed myself back against the metal. "You think just because you kept one of them out, you're safe?" She let out a loud, insane laugh, her eyes wide and darting around. "You haven't done shit. All you've done is delayed the inevitable. You can't win against these things. They are as old as the earth itself. They will find a way inside sooner or later. And then what Carpenter told me would happen, will. And you will scream. You will all scream." The eyes locked onto mine, and in that instant, I realized that everything she had said earlier had been true. It had wanted her to know, to tell all of us. To tell me. "But you, Desmond? You will scream last and loudest. And it will be a torture and agony which you could never possibly imagine." She raised the arm that held the scalpel. "Good does not triumph over evil where evil lives, and God? God will not save you." Down here laughing maniacally, she raised the scalpel to her neck, and in one fluid motion, slit her throat from ear to ear. Figueroa's scream beside me stung my eardrums as her body fell to the ground, her mouth gurgling as she died. But it was not loud enough to mask the sound of the buzzer signaling that the west airlock had finished draining, and the hatch unlocking. That moment was over 2 hours ago, though it seems more like an eternity to me. The four of us ran, and I saw the others stumble out of the operations room in a daze, the spell on them now lifted. I knew it was only because they wanted them all to see what was coming through that hatch, wanted them to feel the same horror that Notting and Carpenter and the others must have felt in the last moments of their lives, because they savor every drop of it. They wanted them conscious to witness their own deaths. I never looked back. I didn't want to see it tear into the first of the people I'd come to call my friends, see them torn apart slowly. I heard their screams, though. A single one, Then silence for a time. Then another. All in almost the same way as we'd heard nodding scream through the speakers. King and Alton had become separated from Figueroa and me. I don't know where they'd gone, but we heard their screams about an hour later, one after the other. The two of us, the last two remaining, had locked ourselves in the research lab, cowering under the table with the computer that had finished decoding the warning that I already knew by now in my heart and soul. Stay away from here. Evil is imprisoned below, death is what you shall find if you stay. Figueroa ran away half an hour ago. She had put her hands over her ears, no doubt being mentally tortured by the monster, not the small ones, but the one that peers out of its newly unlocked prison, its horrible face filled with malicious glee at what it is able to do once again. It must have become too much for her, because she finally wrenched herself free from my arms, ran to the closed hatch and was gone. I know I should have been the brave one and gone after her, but I was just too afraid. I dashed across the room and resealed the door before attempting to barricade it with another table in the lab, though I know that when those monsters choose to come for me, that will not stop them or slow their pursuit. I heard her scream 5 minutes ago. I know I am all that remains of the entire team. And that is why I am hastily scrawling this account on a few sheets of scrap paper I found on top of the desk I hide under. Because somebody needs to know the truth about what has happened down here. I hear them pressing against the walls of the lab now. I can hear their soft hissing cries of glee as they slowly inch closer to the hatch. But over all of that, I can hear their goddamn master whispering to me in my head. Whispering to me in the voice of the person I loved and cared for most in this whole world. It delights in telling me in that voice all of the things it is planning to do to me. Things that I cannot bear to write down, for I will lose the last tendrils of sanity left in my body. Brockman was right. It did leave me until last. It let me hear the ends of all of the others, let each kill shatter a part of my soul. And now that it has almost completely broken me, it is sending its underlings for me. They will break into my temporary refuge. They will hurt me, they will bite and slash me until I am half dead. But they will not kill me. No. That honor is reserved for the master. The monster that is the source of old sailors' tales, of legends as far back as man has dwelled on this planet. They will drag my almost lifeless body out of the airlock, forcing me into my suit to keep me from drowning, and then bring me back to those godforsaken ruins. To that hole, that broken lock, and down where it awaits me, to make my death something that even the cosmos will take notice of. I am placing this account into the inner compartment of the emergency distress beacon hooked into the wall on the opposite side of the lab, and then sending it up to the surface. Please, I beg of you one final time, do not come down here looking for us. Stay away from this stretch of ocean at any costs. We have unleashed something that the creatures who locked it away tried to keep hidden from us, for our sake, humanity's sake. This is a place that we were never meant to go. Nothing but death awaits you down here in the void. Stay away.